When the Siege of Leningrad began in September 1941, few civilians understood what that word would truly mean. A siege suggested isolation, bombardment, hardship, but not annihilation by hunger. Within weeks, German and Finnish forces had encircled the city completely, cutting off rail lines, roads, and nearly all supply routes. Leningrad, a city of more than 2.5 million people, was suddenly sealed off from the rest of the Soviet Union. Food warehouses burned during early air raids, electricity failed, heating systems collapsed, and winter approached faster than anyone was prepared for. The German strategy was not to storm the city, but to erase it slowly. Orders intercepted after the war made the intention clear. Leningrad was to be starved into submission. No surrender terms, no relief, just time and hunger. For the civilians trapped inside, survival would soon be measured not in days or weeks, but in grams. By November, official bread rations were slashed to levels never before recorded in a modern city. Workers received 250 grams per day. Dependents, children, and the elderly received just 125 grams of bread, a piece barely larger than a matchbox. And even that bread was no longer bread in any recognizable sense. Flour was bulked out with sawdust, cellulose, ground straw, and sometimes wallpaper paste. It crumbled in the hand, tasted bitter, and provided almost no nutrition. Yet it became the most precious object in the city. People lined up for hours in freezing temperatures, clutching ration cards like passports to life. Many collapsed while waiting. Others froze to death, standing upright, their bodies discovered still holding their place in line. Those who survived learned quickly. The bread must be eaten slowly, carefully in tiny bites, because once it was gone, there was nothing until tomorrow. Inside apartments, life began to contract around hunger. Furniture was dismantled and burned for heat. Books, picture frames, and even wooden toys disappeared into stoves that barely warmed rooms kept well below freezing. People stopped washing to conserve energy. They stopped talking to conserve strength. Stairs became deadly obstacles. Many lacked the energy to climb back up after leaving their flats. Entire families lay together under blankets, not for warmth, but because moving separately wasted calories they no longer had. Death became so common that it lost its shock. Bodies remained in apartments for days or weeks because relatives were too weak to carry them outside. The sound of sleds scraping across frozen streets became constant, not carrying supplies, but corpses, dragged to mass graves by neighbors who hoped they would not be next. And yet, within this slow collapse, people adapted in ways that defied logic. Hunger sharpened ingenuity. Civilians boiled leather belts, glue, and shoe soles to extract trace nutrients. They scraped paste from the backs of wallpaper. They learned which trees had edible bark, which machine oils could be filtered, which industrial byproducts could be repurposed as fuel. Parents lied to children about having already eaten. Children learned to lie back. In diaries recovered after the war, survivors described how hunger distorted time, memory, and emotion, how the body weakened first, but the mind lingered, painfully aware of every loss. To survive on 125 grams of bread was not merely a physical challenge, it was a daily negotiation with despair, and winter had only just begun. The winter of 1941 to 1942 descended on Leningrad with a cruelty that few survivors would ever find words for. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, and the city, already stripped of fuel and electricity, froze from the inside out. Water pipes burst and stopped working entirely, forcing civilians to collect ice from the Neva River and melt it indoors over makeshift stoves fueled by anything that could burn. Trams stopped running. Factories went silent. Hospitals functioned without heat, light, or medicine. Starvation accelerated rapidly. By December, thousands were dying every day, not in dramatic moments of violence, but quietly, in beds, on stairwells, in queues, and on the streets. The human body, deprived of calories, began consuming itself. People lost muscle first, then fat, Then the ability to regulate temperature or think clearly. Swelling set in, limbs became heavy and unresponsive, and simple movements felt impossible. Many civilians described the same sensation, hunger so constant it became physical pain, followed by a strange calm as the body began to shut down. Daily life collapsed into a narrow routine centered entirely around survival. People woke only to secure bread, water, and fuel, if they could still walk. Those who left their apartments often never returned. Stairs became graveyards. Residents would find bodies days later frozen mid-step. Entire households disappeared behind closed doors, discovered only when neighbors noticed the smell or the silence. The city authorities attempted to maintain order, but systems failed faster than they could be repaired. Public services ceased. Garbage collection stopped. Bodies accumulated in courtyards and hallways, wrapped in sheets, or nothing at all. The sound of sleds scraping across frozen streets became one of the defining noises of the siege as the dead were dragged to collection points or mass graves. Death was no longer shocking, it was expected. Survivors later wrote that grief dulled, not because they cared less, but because feeling too much consumed energy they could not spare. Hunger reshaped morality in ways that made survivors deeply uncomfortable, even decades later. Food became the only currency that mattered. People traded family heirlooms, clothing, and furniture for a handful of flour or a bowl of soup. Trust eroded. Theft increased, not out of malice, but desperation. Parents hid food from children. Children stole from parents. Neighbors avoided one another's eyes, afraid of what hunger might drive them to do. In official records and private diaries, authorities acknowledged cases of cannibalism, rare but real, treated not as crimes of evil, but as symptoms of total starvation. The city tried to suppress these accounts during the war, but they remain among the most painful truths of the Siege of Leningrad. Hunger did not just weaken bodies, it stripped away the social fabric that made life recognizable. And yet, even as normal life collapsed, fragments of humanity endured. Some continued to work despite barely being able to stand, driven by a belief that usefulness itself was a form of resistance. Teachers gathered children in unheated classrooms to maintain routine. Librarians kept reading rooms open for those who could no longer heat their homes. Musicians practiced with numb fingers. Writers recorded what they saw, even as they themselves starved, convinced that someone, someday, would need to know. These acts did not stop the dying, but they preserved something essential: the idea that Leningrad was still alive. Surviving on 125 grams of bread was not simply about calories, it was about enduring long enough to remember who you were before hunger tried to erase you. As starvation tightened its grip on Leningrad, a single fragile lifeline emerged, not from strategy rooms or grand offensives, but from geography itself. To the east of the city lay Lake Ladoga, vast and unforgiving, the only direction not fully sealed by German and Finnish forces. In summer, barges attempted to carry supplies across its waters under constant air attack. But it was winter that transformed the lake into something unprecedented: a road. When the ice thickened enough to support weight, Soviet engineers carved a supply route directly across the frozen surface. It became known simply as the Road of Life. For the civilians of Leningrad, it was not a metaphor. It was the difference between slow extinction and the faint possibility of survival. Trucks loaded with flour, grain, and fuel drove across the ice at night, headlights blacked out, engines straining in sub-zero temperatures, knowing that one wrong move could send them through the frozen surface into black water below. The journey was as deadly as the siege itself. German aircraft targeted the convoys relentlessly, strafing the ice and bombing supply columns that had nowhere to hide. Artillery fire cracked the surface, opening fractures that swallowed vehicles whole. Drivers learned to listen to the ice, to feel vibrations through the steering wheel, to keep exact distances between trucks so the ice wouldn't collapse under combined weight. Many drivers never returned. Their trucks disappeared beneath the lake, cargo lost, names never recovered. Yet others kept driving, night after night, because stopping meant condemning an entire city. The supplies that reached Leningrad were heartbreakingly small compared to need, but each sack of flour was divided, rationed, and transformed into bread that kept thousands alive for one more day. At the same time, the road of life carried people out, mostly children, the sick, and the elderly, evacuated across the ice in trucks or on sleds, wrapped in blankets, many too weak to cry. Some died en route. Others survived but never saw their families again. Inside Leningrad, news of the road spread quietly, almost cautiously. People did not celebrate it. Hope was too dangerous. But bread rations stabilized slightly. For some, the difference between 125 and 200 grams meant survival instead of collapse. Still, the road was never enough. Supplies arrived sporadically, delayed by weather, attacks, or structural failures in the ice. Civilians learned not to expect consistency. Hunger remained constant, but despair was tempered by the knowledge that the city was not entirely forgotten. Diaries from the period describe the road as thin as a thread, fragile as glass, and louder in absence than in arrival. When convoys failed to arrive, panic spread. When they did arrive, the city breathed for a moment. The road of life was not a triumph of abundance, but of endurance. It did not end starvation, it slowed it. It did not save everyone, it saved enough. Those who survived on 125 grams of bread did so knowing that somewhere beyond the frozen horizon, trucks were risking everything to reach them. For many civilians, that knowledge mattered as much as the food itself. It meant the siege had not succeeded in its ultimate goal, erasure. Leningrad was starving, freezing, and dying, but it was still connected to the world beyond the encirclement. And as long as that connection existed, however fragile, survival remained possible, one dangerous crossing at a time. By the second year of the Siege of Leningrad, hunger was no longer an emergency. It was a permanent condition. For children and families, this changed everything about how life was experienced and remembered. Childhood, as it had existed before the war, vanished almost overnight. Children stopped playing not because it was forbidden, but because their bodies no longer had the strength. Many grew silent, conserving energy, lying still for hours to reduce the burning ache in their stomachs. Parents watched this transformation with quiet terror. They could see their children shrinking, their faces hollowing, their voices weakening, and there was almost nothing they could do. Bread rations were divided with painful precision. Parents often gave their portion to their children, telling them they had already eaten, even as their own bodies deteriorated. In diaries, mothers wrote about cutting bread into equal fragments, then secretly shaving crumbs from their own piece when no one was looking. Survival became an act of constant sacrifice, measured in grams and guilt. Families lived with loss as a daily presence. It was common for households to lose one member at a time, a grandparent first, then a parent, sometimes a child. Death did not arrive dramatically. It came quietly, often during sleep. Survivors woke to find loved ones cold beside them, their faces peaceful, their bodies too heavy to move. Many families lacked the strength to bury the dead immediately. Corpses remained in apartments, wrapped in sheets, placed on balconies, or stored near windows until someone could summon the energy to drag them away. Children grew accustomed to seeing death without ceremony. Some were evacuated across the road of life and survived, only to discover after the war that everyone they had left behind was gone. Others remained in the city and carried memories that would haunt them for decades. Survivors later described an emotional numbness, not cruelty, but a necessary shield against grief that would otherwise consume what little strength remained. The psychological toll of surviving on 125 grams of bread extended far beyond the siege itself. Even after liberation, many survivors struggled to return to normal life. Hunger left permanent marks: obsessive food-saving habits, fear of waste, Anxiety around scarcity. Former children of the siege recalled hiding bread long after food was plentiful, unable to trust abundance. Relationships were shaped by survival choices that were never forgotten. Some survivors carried shame for living when others did not. Others carried anger, at authorities, at fate, even at loved ones whose deaths they could not prevent. In interviews conducted decades later, survivors spoke of the siege as a dividing line in their lives. Before hunger and after hunger. The body recovered faster than the mind. Starvation had taught lessons no one ever wanted to learn. And yet, within families, bonds also deepened in extraordinary ways. Small acts of care took on immense meaning. A parent brushing a child's hair with frozen fingers, siblings sharing warmth under a single blanket, neighbors checking silently on one another through thin walls. Children who survived often credited not food but love and routine, however fragile, with keeping them alive. Parents read stories from memory when books were burned for fuel. Teachers continued lessons in unheated rooms to preserve a sense of future. These moments did not erase suffering, but they resisted its attempt to reduce life to biology alone. To survive the Siege of Leningrad on 125 grams of bread required more than calories. It required the will to protect one another's humanity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. When the Siege of Leningrad was finally lifted in January 1944, it did not arrive with celebration, music, or immediate relief. The city was too exhausted for that. Nearly 900 days of starvation, cold, and isolation had hollowed it out. More than 1 million civilians were dead, most from hunger. Those who survived emerged slowly, cautiously, as if unsure the siege was truly over. Food supplies improved, heating returned, and transport links reopened, but recovery was uneven and painfully slow. Many survivors were physically unrecognizable from who they had been before the war. Bodies were weakened, organs damaged, immune systems compromised. Some would never fully recover. Yet even as life began to normalize, the habits of starvation remained. People continued to hoard food, to eat slowly, to fear empty shelves. Bread, once reduced to 125 grams, retained an almost sacred significance. Survivors later said that liberation did not erase hunger. It merely removed the certainty that it would kill them. In the years that followed, the Siege of Leningrad became both a symbol of endurance and a subject of silence. Official narratives emphasized heroism, resilience, and victory, while the darker realities of starvation were often softened or omitted. Many survivors did not speak openly about what they had endured, not because they forgot, but because remembering was painful, and because some experiences resisted language altogether. Diaries were hidden away, personal losses went unspoken, yet memory persisted in quieter forms, in the way people treated food, in the reverence shown to bread, in the annual commemorations that honored the dead without needing to recount every detail. For those who had survived on 125 grams of bread, survival itself felt ambiguous, a mix of gratitude, sorrow, guilt, and disbelief. They had lived not because they were stronger or more deserving, but because chance, timing, and small mercies had aligned just enough. Looking back, survivors rarely described themselves as heroes. Instead, they spoke of endurance, of doing what was necessary when no alternatives existed. The Siege of Leningrad was not survived through bravery alone, but through routine, sacrifice, and a refusal to give up on one another. Parents starved so children might live. Strangers carried the dead for neighbors too weak to move. Drivers crossed frozen lakes knowing they might not return. Teachers taught. Musicians played. Civilians survived on 125 grams of bread, not because it was enough, but because it had to be. And in that grim arithmetic of survival, Leningrad endured. The city was not conquered, not erased, and not forgotten. Its survival stands as one of the starkest reminders of what civilians can endure and what war demands of those who never chose to fight it.